The tension in the air was almost visible on Flight 237 to Dallas that fateful Tuesday afternoon. The Boeing 737 was packed to capacity, a mixture of business travelers in pressed suits and families heading for vacation. It was one of those flights where everyone seemed to be in their own bubble, some watching movies on tiny screens, others trying to catch some sleep despite the constant hum of the engines. In row 14, a young black teenager named Thomas was quietly reading a book. At just 17, he was traveling alone to visit his grandparents for the summer. He was a quiet kid, basketball player at his high school, with dreams of becoming an engineer someday. The flight had been smooth so far, and Thomas was deeply engrossed in his science fiction novel. 3 rows behind Thomas sat a middle-aged man with thinning gray hair and a permanent scowl etched across his face. People around him had already noted his sour mood during boarding when he'd complained loudly about the incompetent staff and terrible service. The flight attendants had exchanged knowing glances. They'd seen his type before. As the flight reached cruising altitude, Thomas got up to use the restroom. On his way back to his seat, he accidentally bumped into the arm of the scowling passenger, causing the man to spill a few drops of his drink on his khaki pants. "I'm really sorry, sir," Thomas said immediately, his voice sincere as he reached for a napkin to help. The man's face contorted with rage, his cheeks flushing a dangerous shade of red. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice rising above the ambient noise of the cabin. Several passengers looked up from their books and screens. "I didn't mean to," Thomas began, but before he could finish his sentence, the man stood up, towering over him. "You people are all the same," he hissed, words dripping with venom. "No respect for anyone else." A hush fell over the surrounding rows as passengers realized what was happening. Thomas froze, a deer caught in headlights, unsure how to respond to such unexpected hostility. The man wasn't finished. "I paid good money for this flight, and I don't need some punk ruining it." His voice grew louder with each word, drawing more attention from across the cabin. "Sir, I apologized," Thomas said calmly, showing a maturity beyond his years. "It was an accident." What happened next shocked everyone on the plane. The man's open palm came swinging through the air, connecting with Thomas's face with a crack that seemed to echo throughout the cabin. The force of the slap sent the teenager stumbling backward against the seats. Gasps erupted from all directions. A woman screamed. Time seemed to stand still as the reality of what had just occurred sank in. A grown man had just struck a minor in full view of dozens of witnesses. Thomas stood there, hand to his reddening cheek, eyes wide with disbelief and hurt. He'd experienced racism before, but never such a public physical assault. The man remained standing, his chest heaving, seemingly unrepentant. "Return to your seat immediately," a flight attendant called out, rushing down the aisle toward the commotion, her face a mixture of shock and determination. But before she could reach the scene, there was movement in row 8. A passenger who had been quietly sitting by the window throughout the flight slowly stood up. He wasn't particularly tall, but something about his presence commanded attention. His beard was neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp and focused. Though he was in his 70s, he moved with the confidence and fluidity of someone half his age. Passengers who recognized him whispered in disbelief, "Is that? No way. It can't be." Chuck Norris, martial arts champion, action movie star, and cultural icon, stepped into the aisle. He hadn't said a word yet, but his very presence seemed to change the atmosphere on the plane. Unlike his action movies, there was no dramatic music, no slow-motion walk, just a quiet determination as he made his way toward the unfolding situation. The flight attendant paused, uncertain of how to handle this unexpected development. The angry passenger, still standing, suddenly looked less confident as he realized who was approaching. Thomas, still stunned from the slap, watched wide-eyed as Chuck Norris stopped directly between him and his attacker. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The entire plane seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The air crackled with anticipation. Some passengers had their phones out, recording what was surely about to become a viral moment. What nobody expected was the calm, measured tone in Chuck's voice when he finally broke the silence. "I think we all need to take a breath here," he said, his voice carrying authority without aggression. He turned first to Thomas, acknowledging him with respect. "Are you okay, young man?" Thomas nodded, still too shocked to speak. The simple, human gesture, being asked if he was okay, seemed to break through his shock, and his eyes welled with tears he was determined not to shed. Chuck then turned to face the man who had thrown the slap. Instead of the roundhouse kick that internet memes might have predicted, Chuck did something more powerful. He looked the man directly in the eyes, unblinking, unflinching. "That's not how we solve problems," he said firmly. "Not in the air, not on the ground, not anywhere." The man's bravado was rapidly deflating under Chuck Norris's steady gaze. He shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very aware of the dozens of disapproving eyes on him. He opened his mouth to retort, but something in Chuck's expression made him reconsider. "I don't know what's going on in your life that made you think it was okay to hit a kid," Chuck continued, his voice low enough that only those nearby could hear. "But today you have a choice. You can make this situation worse, or you can make it better." The plane remained in tense silence as the moment stretched on. The angry passengers' eyes darted around, looking anywhere but at Chuck or Thomas. The flight attendants had gathered at either end of the aisle, ready to intervene but seeming to understand that something important was unfolding, something that required patience rather than procedure. What happened next would change the course of the flight and perhaps the lives of everyone involved. But as tensions hung in the balance, one thing was already clear. The simple act of someone standing up against injustice had already made a difference. Thomas stood a little straighter, finding strength in the unexpected support. The other passengers watched with renewed faith in humanity. And in that suspended moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, a small but significant battle against hatred was being fought with dignity rather than fists. The silence on Flight 237 stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. Every eye was fixed on the standoff between Chuck Norris and the angry passenger who had just slapped young Thomas. Even the constant hum of the airplane engines seemed to quiet down, as if the aircraft itself was holding its breath. Chuck maintained his calm but unwavering stance between Thomas and the aggressor. His years of martial arts training were evident not in violence but in his perfect balance and centered presence. He didn't need to throw a punch. His very posture spoke of a man who could handle himself if needed but preferred wisdom over force. "Sir," Chuck said, his voice low but clear, "I've spent my life learning how to fight, but more importantly, I've learned when not to." He gestured toward Thomas. "This young man bumped your arm by accident." He apologized. There was no need for what happened next. The man's face flushed red again, but this time from embarrassment rather than anger. Being called out by Chuck Norris was not how he'd planned to spend his Tuesday flight. Some passengers had recognized the action star and were whispering to their neighbors, explaining who he was. "It's none of your business," the man muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "When someone hits a kid in front of me, I make it my business," Chuck replied without raising his voice. "Now we have two choices here. This can escalate and end with you in handcuffs when we land, or we can find a better way forward." A flight attendant named Diane stepped forward, clipboard in hand. She'd been flying this route for 15 years and had never seen anything quite like this situation. "Sir," she addressed the man who had thrown the slap, "we have a zero-tolerance policy for violence on our flights. I've already notified the captain, and authorities will meet us upon landing." The man's face drained of color. His eyes darted around like a cornered animal, looking for escape where there was none. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a baby started crying, the wail cutting through the tension. It wasn't," the man stammered, suddenly seeming smaller. "Look, I've had a terrible day. I just got laid off. My wife is talking about leaving me, and I snapped. I shouldn't have done that." He looked at Thomas for the first time without anger. "I'm sorry, kid, I was wrong." Thomas stood straight, rubbing his cheek where a red mark was still visible. For a 17-year-old facing a public assault and its aftermath, he showed remarkable composure. "Thank you for apologizing," Thomas said quietly. I accept it. Chuck studied both of them carefully. That's a start, he said. But actions have consequences. An older woman 3 rows up stood up. She had salt and pepper hair pulled back in a neat bun and wore a cardigan despite the warm cabin temperature. I'm Dr. Rivera, she announced. I'm a psychologist. Perhaps I can help mediate this situation. It seems like there's more going on here than meets the eye. Diane, the flight attendant, looked relieved at this unexpected assistance. That would be helpful, Doctor, thank you. We still have 2 hours before landing in Dallas. With Chuck's nod of approval, they relocated Thomas to an empty seat in first class, a small gesture of goodwill from the airline. The man who had hit him, whose name they learned was Robert, was moved to the back row where a male flight attendant could keep a close eye on him. Dr. Rivera shuttled between them, speaking quietly with each. Meanwhile, Chuck returned to his seat, but not before several passengers stopped him to shake his hand or thank him for stepping up. He accepted their gratitude with humble nods, deflecting praise. Anyone would have done the same, he told a young mother who thanked him while bouncing a fussy toddler on her hip. But they didn't, she pointed out. You did. An hour into their remaining flight time, Dr. Rivera approached Chuck's seat and leaned down to speak quietly. Mr. Norris, I wonder if you might help me with something. Robert has calmed down considerably and feels genuine remorse. Thomas says he's willing to hear him out. Would you consider sitting in on a conversation between them? Your presence seems to provide a sense of security for Thomas and, frankly, keeps Robert on his best behavior. Chuck checked his watch. Of course, Doctor. They gathered in the small galley area at the back of the plane. The flight attendants had cordoned it off with a beverage cart to give them privacy while still keeping the interaction visible to crew members. Thomas arrived first, standing tall but nervously fingering the zipper of his hoodie. Chuck placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, he told the teenager. Thomas shook his head. No, I want to. My grandfather always says that understanding beats anger any day. Your grandfather sounds like a wise man, Chuck said with an approving nod. When Robert joined them, he looked different. Deflated, the anger drained out of him, replaced by something that looked like shame. He couldn't meet Thomas's eyes at first. Dr. Rivera facilitated the conversation with professional grace. Robert, would you like to explain to Thomas what you told me earlier? Robert took a deep breath. I grew up in a home where my father solved problems with his fists, he began, his voice barely audible above the airplane noise. I promised myself I'd never be that man. But today, when you spilled my drink, it wasn't about you at all. I lost my job yesterday after 23 years with the company. Just a cold email saying my position had been eliminated. He paused, swallowing hard. I've been angry at the world and I took it out on you because you were there. The color of your skin made you an easy target for my frustration, and that's on me, all of it. There's no excuse for what I did. Thomas listened without interrupting. When Robert finished, the young man showed wisdom beyond his years. I'm sorry about your job, he said sincerely. That must be really hard. But you're right. There's no excuse for hitting someone, especially not because of their race. Chuck had remained silent, letting the conversation unfold naturally, but now he spoke up. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, Robert, and it takes even more courage to forgive Thomas. You both showed character today. Dr. Rivera smiled. I've suggested that Robert look into anger management counseling when we land, and he's agreed. Robert nodded. My father never apologized for anything in his life. I don't want to be him anymore. As they prepared to return to their seats for landing, Thomas extended his hand to Robert. After a moment's hesitation, Robert shook it. The gesture was small, but significant, a bridge across a divide that had seemed uncrossable just hours before. Word of what had happened spread throughout the plane. As passengers prepared for landing, many were discussing the incident in hushed tones. Something had shifted in the collective atmosphere of Flight 237. People who had been strangers 3 hours ago were now talking, sharing stories, making connections. Businessman handed his card to a college student, offering to talk about internship opportunities. An elderly couple invited the frazzled young mother sitting across from them to join them for lunch during their layover, offering to help with her toddler. Small acts of kindness rippled through the cabin. As the plane began its descent into Dallas, Chuck gazed out his window at the sprawling city below. In his decades as a martial artist and actor, he had faced countless opponents, but sometimes the most important battles weren't physical at all. Sometimes they were about standing up and showing others that there's a better way. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom announcing their final approach, but for the passengers of Flight 237, this journey had become about much more than just reaching a destination. The wheels of Flight 237 touched down on the Dallas runway with a gentle bump. The usual rush to grab bags from overhead compartments didn't immediately happen. Instead, passengers remained seated, many still processing the remarkable events they had witnessed. The incident between Thomas, Robert, and Chuck Norris had transformed a routine flight into something meaningful. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, Thomas stood up from his first-class seat, looking back toward where Robert sat at the rear of the plane. Their eyes met briefly across the distance. No more anger, just a quiet acknowledgement. Thomas gave a small nod, which Robert returned. Chuck gathered his simple carry-on bag. Nothing flashy for the martial arts legend, just a well-worn leather backpack. Several passengers pulled out phones, hoping for a selfie with the star, but the flight attendants gently reminded everyone to keep moving toward the exits. "Mr. Norris," called Diane, the head flight attendant. "The captain would like a word with you before you deplane." Chuck followed her to the cockpit where Captain Reynolds, a veteran pilot with silver hair and kind eyes, extended his hand. "I want to thank you personally," the captain said. "We train for all sorts of emergencies, mechanical failures, weather issues, medical events. But situations like what happened today, those are the toughest to handle. You stepped up when it mattered." Chuck shook his hand firmly. "Just happened to be in the right place," he replied modestly. "Well, the crew and I appreciate it. I've been flying for 32 years and I've seen how quickly things can escalate at 30,000 feet. What you did back there, de-escalating without violence, that was masterful." As Chuck made his way through the jet bridge, he spotted Thomas waiting just inside the terminal, standing beside a man who looked to be in his 60s, his grandfather, Chuck guessed from the family resemblance. "There he is, Grandpa," Thomas said, his face lighting up. "That's Chuck Norris I told you about on the phone." The older man approached with tears in his eyes. "Mr. Norris, I'm George, Thomas's grandfather. My wife and I have been raising him since he was 8. His voice cracked slightly. "I just want to say thank you for standing up for my grandson when he needed someone." Chuck clasped the man's outstretched hand between both of his. "Your grandson showed incredible maturity today. You should be proud. He handled himself with dignity in a situation where many grown men would have lost their cool." George nodded, emotion evident on his weathered face. "We taught him to be strong, but we also taught him that strength isn't about fighting. It's about knowing when to walk away and when to stand your ground." "Wise words," Chuck agreed. "Sounds like you could teach my martial arts students a thing or two." Thomas stepped forward, nervous but determined. "Mr. Norris, could I ask you something?" "Of course. Why did you help me?" "You didn't know me. You could have just stayed in your seat like everyone else." Chuck considered the question carefully. It wasn't about seeking praise or recognition. The boy genuinely wanted to understand. "Because there comes a time when watching from the sidelines isn't enough," Chuck finally replied. "In my life, I've learned that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's acting despite that fear. Everyone on that plane saw what happened, but being a bystander is the easy choice." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "The world changes when ordinary people decide to do the right thing, even when it's difficult." A small crowd had gathered, at a respectful distance, some filming with their phones, others just watching the interaction. Among them stood Dr. Rivera, the psychologist who had helped mediate on the plane. "Mr. Norris," she called, approaching the small group. "I thought you'd want to know. Robert just left with the airport police. They're not arresting him, but he's agreed to make a formal apology and attend the anger management program I recommended." Thomas looked surprised. He's really going to do that? Dr. Rivera nodded. Sometimes people need a wake-up call to change. What happened today might be exactly what he needed. She handed Thomas a business card. And if you need to talk about today's experience, please call my office. The airline has agreed to cover any counseling sessions you might want. As the terminal buzzed with activity around them, a local news reporter approached with a cameraman. Mr. Norris, we heard about what happened on the flight. Would you be willing to give us a statement? Before Chuck could answer, airport security arrived to escort him through the terminal, away from the growing crowd. Sorry, but Mr. Norris has a tight schedule, the head of security explained to the disappointed reporter. As they walked, the security officer glanced at Chuck. My team and I are big fans, sir. Delta Airlines called ahead. They've upgraded your connecting flight to first class. Chuck thanked him but seemed distracted, looking back toward Thomas and his grandfather, who were now surrounded by curious travelers asking questions. Could you do me a favor? Chuck asked the security officer. Make sure that young man and his grandfather get through this crowd safely. They've been through enough today. The officer nodded. Consider it done. In the VIP lounge, Chuck finally had a moment to himself. He declined the offer of champagne, requesting water instead. As he sat by the window overlooking the runway, his phone buzzed with notifications. Videos of the incident were already spreading across social media platforms, with headlines like, Chuck Norris stops mid-air racism, and action star shows real-life heroism at 30,000 feet. He set the phone aside, not interested in the publicity. Instead, he pulled out a small notebook and began to write. For years, he had been working on a book about his philosophy of life, not just martial arts techniques, but the deeper principles that guided him. Today's experience would make a powerful chapter. As his connecting flight was announced, Chuck packed up his belongings. Walking toward his gate, he passed a television showing news coverage of the incident. The video someone had captured showed, the moment he stood up from his seat, the quiet authority in his stance as he positioned himself between Thomas and Robert. What the video couldn't capture was the chain reaction that had followed. How one person standing up had given others the courage to do the same. How Dr. Rivera had offered her professional skills. How the flight attendants had found their confidence to enforce the rules firmly, but compassionately. How passengers who had been strangers hours before were now exchanging contact information, brought together by witnessing something that reminded them of our shared humanity. At gate C12, Chuck noticed Robert sitting alone, staring at his phone. For a moment he considered walking past, but something made him pause. Robert looked up, recognition and shame crossing his face in equal measure. Mr. Norris, he said quietly. I guess you're probably the last person who wants to talk to me right now. Chuck took the empty seat beside him. Actually, I think you're exactly who I should be talking to. Robert seemed surprised. Why's that? Because you're at a crossroads, Chuck said simply. What happened today can either be the worst day of your life, the day you hit a kid and face the consequences, or it can be the first day of becoming someone better. Robert was quiet for a long moment. I keep watching the videos people posted. I don't even recognize myself. That angry man, that's not who I want to be. Then don't be, Chuck replied. It's that simple, and that difficult. The boarding announcement for Robert's flight interrupted their conversation. As he stood to leave, Robert extended his hand. Thank you for stopping me today. Who knows what might have happened if you hadn't stood up? Chuck shook his hand firmly. The real test starts now when you walk off this airport and back into your real life. Remember how this feels, and choose differently next time. As Robert walked toward his gate, Chuck noticed Thomas and his grandfather watching from nearby. They had witnessed the conversation but hadn't interrupted. Thomas gave Chuck a thumbs up, a simple gesture that said more than words could express. In that moment, as travelers rushed past, focused on their destinations, Chuck was reminded of something his own martial arts teacher had told him decades ago. The true measure of a champion isn't how many opponents he defeats, but how many lives he impacts for the better. Looking at Thomas's hopeful face and Robert's hunched but determined shoulders as he boarded his flight, Chuck knew that today, in this ordinary airport on this ordinary Tuesday, something extraordinary had happened. Not because Chuck Norris had been involved, but because people had found the courage to face uncomfortable truths and choose a better path forward. And sometimes, that was the greatest victory of all. 2 weeks after the incident on Flight 237, Thomas sat at his grandfather's kitchen table in Dallas, finishing his homework. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting a warm glow over the worn but clean linoleum. His grandmother hummed in the background as she kneaded dough for her famous sweet potato pie. "Thomas, honey, could you check the mail?" she called, her hands covered in flour. Outside, the Texas heat hit him like a wall. Their modest neighborhood was quiet at this hour, most folks still at work or staying cool indoors. Thomas walked down the cracked concrete path to the mailbox, thinking about how much had changed since that flight 2 weeks ago. The videos had gone viral overnight. "Teen stands strong against racism. Chuck Norris intervenes," read one headline. "Action star shows real heroism at 30,000 feet," proclaimed another. Thomas had received messages from kids at his school, from strangers online, even from a few college admissions officers who were impressed by his maturity in a difficult situation. His phone buzzed with a text from his basketball coach. "Practice. Moved to 6 p.m. Gym AC finally fixed." Thomas smiled. The normalcy felt good after the whirlwind of attention. He opened the mailbox and sorted through the usual bills and flyers. Among them was a padded envelope addressed to him. No return address, just his name written in neat block letters. Back inside, he set the bills on the counter for his grandfather and sat down with the mysterious package. "What's that you got there?" his grandmother asked, sliding her pie into the oven. "Not sure?" Thomas replied, carefully opening the envelope. Inside was a book, The Secret Power Within, Zen Solutions for Real Problems by Chuck Norris. Thomas had mentioned to his grandfather that he wanted to read it after everything that happened. As the book slid into his hands, a note fell out. "Thomas, true strength isn't in the punch you throw, but in the one you choose not to. Keep standing tall. Chuck N." Thomas stared at the signature, running his fingers over the handwritten words. "Well, I'll be," his grandmother said, peering over his shoulder. "That man really is something special." Thomas's grandfather came through the front door, home from his shift at the hospital where he worked in maintenance. His face lit up seeing Thomas with the book. "That come today?" he asked, setting down his lunchbox. "About time. I was starting to think he forgot." Thomas looked up in surprise. "You knew about this?" His grandfather smiled. "Got a call from Mr. Norris's assistant last week. Wanted to make sure we got the right address." He sat down with a groan, his knees protesting after a long day on his feet. "That's not all. Got an interesting call at work today." Thomas raised his eyebrows questioningly. "That reporter who interviewed you for the local news? Her station wants to do a follow-up story. Not just about what happened on the plane, but about what's happened since." Thomas's story had resonated with people in a way no one expected. The video of Chuck Norris stepping in had gone viral, of course. Celebrity involvement always captured attention, but it was the aftermath that kept people talking. Several passengers from Flight 237 had formed an online group. They called themselves Flight Family, and were using their unexpected connection to work on anti-bullying and anti-racism initiatives. Dr. Rivera, the psychologist, was now offering free monthly workshops on conflict resolution. The airline had announced new training protocols for flight attendants on handling tense situations. They also want to interview Robert, his grandfather added quietly. Thomas's hands stilled on the book. "Robert? He agreed to that?" "Apparently. So his anger management counselor thinks it might be good for him. Part of making amends." The idea of seeing Robert again stirred complicated feelings. Thomas had accepted his apology on the plane, but the memory of that slap, the shock and humiliation of it, still stung when he let himself think about it. His grandmother came over, wiping her hands on her apron. "You don't have to do it. If you don't want to, child, you've done more than enough already." Thomas opened Chuck's book, flipping through the pages. One highlighted passage caught his eye. "Facing your fears is the path to inner peace." "No," Thomas said finally. "I think I should do it. If Robert's trying to change, that's important. The news segment was filmed 3 days later in a community center halfway between Thomas's neighborhood and Robert's apartment across town. The neutral location had been Dr. Rivera's suggestion. Thomas arrived early with his grandparents, nervous despite his decision. The news team was setting up lights and cameras while the reporter, a woman named Lydia Chen, reviewed her notes. "Thomas, thank you for coming," she greeted him warmly. "We'll keep this conversational just like we discussed. No ambushes, no gotcha moments." His grandfather squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "We'll be right over there if you need us." When Robert walked in, Thomas almost didn't recognize him. Gone was the angry, red-faced man from the plane. This Robert looked smaller somehow, humbler. He'd gotten a haircut and was wearing a pressed button-down shirt. He approached cautiously, like someone might approach a campfire they weren't sure had gone out. "Hello, Thomas," he said, his voice steady but quiet. "Thank you for agreeing to this." Thomas nodded, not quite ready for more. Dr. Rivera arrived moments later, offering to sit in as a mediator during the interview. "I'm not here as either of your therapists," she explained, "just as a neutral third party to help navigate any difficult moments." The cameras rolled as Lydia guided them through the story. Thomas described how he felt when he was slapped. Robert explained the personal crisis that had preceded his outburst, though he was quick to add, "But that's no excuse. There is no excuse. What have you learned from this experience?" Lydia asked them both. Thomas went first. "I learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means staying calm and maintaining your dignity." He paused. "And I learned that one person standing up, like Mr. Norris did, can give others courage to do the right thing too." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned that I had anger inside me that I never fully acknowledged. Anger that wasn't really about Thomas or anyone else on that plane." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been going to therapy twice a week. I lost my job, my wife left, and I hit rock bottom. But hitting rock bottom can be a foundation to build something new." Off camera, Thomas's grandmother wiped away a tear. "And have you two had any contact since the flight?" Lydia asked. "This is our first time seeing each other," Thomas acknowledged. "But Dr. Rivera has been keeping us both updated." Robert reached slowly into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "Thomas, I brought something for you. You don't have to accept it." Thomas took the envelope carefully. Inside was a gift card for a local college bookstore and a handwritten note for your engineering books when you get to college. "You deserve every opportunity." The cameras captured the genuine surprise on Thomas's face. "How did you know I want to study engineering?" "You mentioned it to Chuck Norris on the plane." "I was listening, even through my anger." Robert looked down at his hands. "It's not much, but I've been setting aside a little from each paycheck at my new job. It seemed right that it should go toward your future." After the interview wrapped, Thomas and Robert stood awkwardly in the parking lot. The news crew was packing up their equipment while Thomas's grandparents chatted with Dr. Rivera near their car. "Your grandparents seem like good people," Robert said. Thomas nodded. "They are. They've raised me since I was 8 when my mom passed away. They did a fine job." Robert scuffed his shoe against the asphalt. "Better than my folks did with me, that's for sure." A silence fell between them. Not comfortable, but not hostile either. "You know," Thomas said finally, "my basketball team is playing this Friday night. It's the regional championship." He hesitated. "If you wanted to come, that would be okay with me." Robert looked up, genuine surprise on his face. "You'd be all right with that? After everything?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. "My grandfather always says that people deserve second chances if they're truly trying to change." He met Robert's eyes directly. "Are you truly trying?" "Every single day," Robert replied without hesitation. As they parted ways, Thomas's phone buzzed with a notification. Someone had tagged him in yet another repost of the plane video. For a while he'd watched every new post, reading the comments, but lately he'd been paying less attention to it. The incident was becoming part of his past rather than defining his present. That evening, as he helped his grandmother with dishes after dinner, he told her about inviting Robert to his game. "You've got a good heart," she said, passing him a plate to dry. "Just like your mother did." "Do you think I did the right thing?" he asked. She considered the question as she scrubbed a stubborn pot. "There's no instruction manual for situations like this, but I believe that kindness is never wasted even when it's hard." She looked at him with pride in her eyes. "Chuck Norris may have stood up on that plane, but you're the one still standing tall every day since." Later that night, Thomas added a line to the college application essay he'd been working on. The prompt asked about a challenge he'd faced and how it had changed him. "Sometimes," he wrote, "the greatest courage isn't in standing against your enemies, but in allowing them the space to become something else, something better. And in that space, you might just become something better too." The gymnasium buzzed with excitement, the bleachers packed with fans from both schools. Championship banners hung from the rafters, and the squeak of sneakers on polished hardwood filled the air. Thomas adjusted his jersey and took a deep breath, trying to focus on the game ahead despite the butterflies in his stomach. "You nervous about the game or about him being here?" asked his teammate Luis, nodding toward the stands. Thomas followed his gaze to where Robert sat, 3 rows up, looking slightly uncomfortable in the noisy crowd. He'd shown up 15 minutes early, wearing a blue button-down that roughly matched the school colors, an effort that hadn't gone unnoticed. "Both, I guess," Thomas admitted, bouncing a basketball against the floor. "Coach says there are college scouts here." Luis grinned, slapping Thomas on the back. "Then we better give them something to see, right?" As the teams warmed up, Thomas spotted his grandparents entering the gym. They waved enthusiastically, making their way to their usual seats. His grandfather with his lucky hat, his grandmother carrying her famous homemade cookies for the team. Thomas smiled, drawing strength from their constant support. What he didn't expect was who followed behind them, Chuck Norris himself, wearing sunglasses and a simple baseball cap in a subtle attempt at anonymity. A murmur rippled through the crowd as people began to notice the celebrity in their midst. Phones came out, pointing in Chuck's direction as he sat beside Thomas's grandparents. Coach Wilson blew his whistle, calling the team into a huddle. "All right, boys, forget about the distractions. Forget about who's watching. Focus on what we've practiced all season." But as they broke from the huddle with their hands raised, Thomas couldn't help glancing at the unexpected gathering in the stands. His grandparents who had raised him with love, Robert who was trying to make amends, and Chuck Norris who had stood up for him when it mattered most. 3 months ago, they had all been strangers. The first half of the game was tight, with neither team gaining a significant lead. Thomas played well, but not spectacularly, too conscious of the eyes on him. During halftime, as the teams retreated to their locker rooms, his grandfather appeared at the door. "Someone wants a quick word with you," he said with a smile. Outside in the quiet hallway, Chuck Norris waited, hands in his pockets. "How you holding up, kid?" he asked. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead with a towel. "Trying my best, sir, but I keep thinking about everything, the scouts, Robert being here, you showing up, it's a lot." Chuck nodded understandingly. "You know what I tell my students before a big tournament? The outcome doesn't define you. Your response to pressure reveals your character, but it doesn't create it." He placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "You already showed what you're made of on that plane. This is just a basketball game." Thomas let the words sink in. "Just a basketball game," he repeated, feeling the tension begin to ease from his shoulders. "And for what it's worth," Chuck added with a smile, "you've got a good jump shot." When Thomas returned to the court for the second half, something had shifted. He moved with greater freedom, worrying less about who was watching and focusing, more on the game itself. He found his rhythm, sinking three-pointers and setting up his teammates with precise passes. In the stands, his grandparents cheered each play. Chuck watched with quiet approval, and Robert, initially so out of place, gradually found himself caught up in the excitement, high-fiving strangers when Thomas made a particularly impressive shot. With 10 seconds left on the clock and the score tied, Coach Wilson called a timeout. The team huddled, sweaty and breathless. "Thomas, you take the last shot," the coach said, drawing a quick play on his clipboard. As they broke from the huddle, Thomas caught Chuck's eye in the crowd. The martial arts master gave him a subtle nod of confidence. The final play unfolded, in what felt like slow motion. The inbound pass, the screen set by his teammates, the ball finding its way into Thomas's hands with 3 seconds left. He pump-faked, sending his defender into the air, then stepped to the side and launched the ball toward the basket as the buzzer sounded. The gymnasium fell silent for a heartbeat as the ball arced through the air, then erupted in cheers as it swished through the net. Thomas's teammates rushed him, lifting him onto their shoulders as the crowd stormed the court. Through the chaos, he saw his grandparents embracing, tears in their eyes. Chuck applauded with a proud smile, and Robert stood in his spot, clapping, with genuine joy for the young man he had once harmed. After the celebration, when the gym had mostly emptied, Thomas found Robert waiting near the locker room exit. "That was some game," Robert said, hands in his pockets. "You've got real talent." "Thanks for coming," Thomas replied, genuinely appreciative. "It means a lot." Robert shifted his weight, clearly working up to something. "I got a call yesterday from Dr. Rivera. She's starting a program at the community center, workshops for men struggling with anger issues. She asked if I'd consider sharing my story." He paused. "Our story?" Thomas raised his eyebrows. "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd have to ask you first. It's your story too, and I won't use it without your permission." Before Thomas could respond, Chuck Norris approached, having said his goodbyes to Thomas's grandparents. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. "I've got a flight to catch, but I wanted to congratulate you, Thomas. Not just on the win, but on how you've handled everything these past few months." He turned to Robert, extending his hand. "And you. It takes courage to face your mistakes and try to make them right." Robert seemed momentarily starstruck as he shook Chuck's hand. "I'm still working on it, sir." "We all are," Chuck replied simply. "That's the point." As Chuck prepared to leave, Thomas remembered something. "Wait, I've been meaning to ask, how did you know to come to the game tonight?" Chuck smiled. "Your grandfather invited me. We've been talking on the phone every few weeks. Good man, your grandfather. Reminds me of my own." With a final nod to them both, the martial arts legend slipped away, surprisingly inconspicuous for a man of his fame. Left alone, Thomas and Robert continued their conversation. "About Dr. Rivera's program," Thomas said thoughtfully. "I think it's a good idea. If hearing about what happened helps other people, then something good comes from it." Relief washed over Robert's face. "Really? You'd be okay with that?" "On one condition," Thomas said. "I want to be there too, not just as part of your story, but to tell my side as well." The following month, Thomas and Robert sat side by side at the community center, facing a group of men who had come for Dr. Rivera's workshop. The room was simple. Folding chairs arranged in a circle, fluorescent lighting overhead, coffee and cookies on a side table. "My name is Robert," he began, his voice steady despite his nerves. 3 months ago, I was the kind of man I promised myself I'd never become." As Robert shared his story, the job loss, the anger, the horrible moment when he struck a teenager on an airplane, Thomas watched the men's reactions. Some looked down at their hands, perhaps recognizing pieces of themselves in Robert's words. Others listened intently, nodding at certain points. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, he talked about the fear and humiliation he'd felt in that moment, but also about the power of Chuck Norris's intervention and his own decision to accept Robert's apology. "The hardest part wasn't being hit," Thomas explained. "It was deciding what kind of person I wanted to be afterward. Would I let this incident make me bitter and angry, or would I choose a different path?" After the workshop, as they helped Dr. Rivera stack chairs, she pulled them both aside. "What you did today will have ripple effects you may never see," she told them. "But they're real." Outside in the parking lot, Thomas checked his phone. He had received an email earlier that day. One he'd been both eager and afraid to open. "Everything okay?" Robert asked, noticing his expression. Thomas took a deep breath and opened the email. His eyes widened as he read. "I got in," he said quietly, then louder. "I got into the engineering program at Texas Tech, full scholarship." Robert's face broke into a genuine smile. That's fantastic. Your grandparents must be thrilled. I haven't told them yet. You're the first to know. The significance of that statement hung in the air between them. From violent confrontation to this moment, a journey neither could have imagined. As the Texas sun began to set, casting long shadows across the community center parking lot, Thomas's phone rang. The caller ID showed his grandfather. I should take this, Thomas said. They're waiting to hear about the scholarship. Robert nodded. Go ahead. And Thomas? Thank you. Not just for today, but for everything. As Thomas walked away to share his good news, he thought about the strange path that had brought them all here. A split-second act of violence on an airplane. A movie star who chose to stand up. A psychologist who happened to be on the same flight. His grandparents' unwavering support. All these pieces coming together to create something unexpected. A story not of lasting harm, but of healing. Over the next year, that story continued to unfold in ways none of them could have predicted. Dr. Rivera's program expanded to other community centers. Robert found steady work and began rebuilding his relationship with his estranged daughter. Thomas thrived in his freshman year at college, joining a mentoring program for high school students interested in engineering. And Chuck Norris. He included the incident in his next book, changing the names but keeping the essence of what had happened. Real power, he wrote, isn't about dominating others. It's about having the strength to help people find their own strength. On the anniversary of Flight 237, Thomas received a package in his college mailbox. Inside was a framed photo of him with his basketball team after winning the championship, along with a note. Sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where you're going, but who you become along the way. The note was signed by Chuck Norris, Robert, and Dr. Rivera, three people who had each in their own way helped shape the man Thomas was becoming. That evening, as he hung the photo beside his engineering textbooks in his dorm room, Thomas thought about how a single moment, perhaps the worst moment of his young life, had somehow led to all of this. Not because of magic or miracle, but because when faced with darkness, enough people had chosen light instead, and in the end, that made all the difference.